Thank you, Cheryl. Now, where I sit, the COVID pandemic has not only scrambled our lives, but also the way we do church. It has forced us to come face to face with the inequality that is behind poverty. And I think it is not true that the pandemic is an equalizer, it hits the rich and the poor. The truth is that the powerful in this country get tested even if they are asymptomatic, while the poor are locked out of hospitals. They cannot even get in and cannot be tested and cannot get treatment. And government policy has little to do with reality. How do you observe social distance when you have 18 million poor households that are greatly packed together, some with as many as 13 adults and 9 children in a few square feet of space? Now, Funmi has earlier given us a shadow, and that is the shadow of the shadow pandemic of domestic violence and social abuse. There is as well the shadow of governments taking advantage of this crisis to silence critics and consolidate their power and establish hegemony over their nations and peoples. Now, how do we respond and reimagine what our churches must be in a time like this? First of all, I think we must begin by thinking of the true normal, not the old normal, because it is abnormal. It is abnormal to have injustice, food scarcity is abnormal, and the degradation of the environment is not normal. Now, scripture gives us some pictures of what true normal may be like. And one of these is the recovery of the sense that we must have mission next door, our Judea, our Samaria, before we have the ends of the earth. Now, this pandemic has forced us not just to use technology a bit more, but to rediscover our neighbor. Our institute, for instance, even if we are not a relief agency, felt that we needed to respond to those who are starving around us. Our office is located in the university town, where if you look closely, there are pockets of poor communities roundabout. And initially, we just wanted to feed 200 families. Now it has ballooned to close to 2,000 households, including Muslim refugees. Now, this experience has challenged us anew on what it means to do incarnational witness. We had to negotiate between the call of compassion and the risk of contamination, because this is an extraordinary situation where those who do relief are themselves at risk. And every day I pray for the protection of our relief team, and I wonder what it must have been like for God to send his son to a world of sin and death. This has also opened our eyes in a new way to Lazarus sitting at the gate. When you live day in and day out in a country like ours, with all the sight of poverty staring you in the face, there comes a time when you no longer see it. It becomes scenery. Lazarus becomes a fixture at the gate and part of the landscape. Now, I imagine this must be true for all the migrant communities living in the West today. They make urban life more colorful, more interesting, except perhaps when they live next door to you and you smell their cooking, or they crowd you out of jobs and living space. Cross-cultural mission has really been shifting since migrants came knocking on our doors. I remember Professor Walls talking about shifting centers of Christianity. You also have shifting centers of mission. Now, the travel is restricted and we are forced to lessen our carbon footprint. We need to pay a bit more attention on what it means to be missional, right where we are. Now, when we think of the Great Commission, we mostly think of the going. But scholars tell us that the main verb in the Great Commission in Matthew 28 is really not the going, but the making of disciples. And what needs discipling are not just individuals, but nations, people with cultures, people with life systems that need to be addressed. And the failure to engage the meta-narratives of cultures and peoples has meant the non-conversion of many cultures, especially Asia, where the great religious traditions on which our cultures are based continue to serve as sources of integration and meaning. The Philippines, for instance, is supposed to be the only Christian nation in Asia. But after 500 years of Christianity, I do not think we have really converted. We have merely adapted. Now, as to being church, this pandemic has brought us back from preoccupation with size, numbers as mega churches, to being families again, to the longing for the warmth and security of small communities. This is a great moment for the church to once again be places of healing, places of comfort to those who are in grief, especially those families that have lost family members who died alone in hospitals and simply were delivered in a box of ashes. For those of us who live in cultures where there is so much ritual and ceremony honoring the dead, it is simply awful that family and relatives disappear just like that. Now, in our search for new wineskins, we may need to ask, what does it mean for the churches to have a broader vision of mission? A vision of the Mission Dei, which is no less than the making of a new heaven and a new earth. Are we in our mission enterprises simply saving souls from a sinking ship, or participating in God's renewal of the world? In a time when the world has come to our doors, what does it mean for host cultures to embrace the strange neighbor that has come to us? What does it mean to be genuinely multicultural churches so that we approximate in the measure that great crowd in Revelation 7, singing praises to God from every tongue and tribe and nation? And for translocated churches, those migrant churches that have come to the West from fragile states and tyrannical societies, what does it take to leverage your relative prosperity and location to engage the powers in your home countries, such that people no longer have to live under duress and become refugees in strange lands? Now, this brings me to the issue of the church in public space. I happen to believe that bad governance happens when the church is absent in public space, or when the church enters the political arena from a wrong footing, like the religious right in America. Where I see it, the Duterte regime has taken advantage of this crisis to jail critics and wipe out left-wing elements. One of our staff recently has raised a fear that our political advocacy may land us in trouble. Apparently, an anti-terrorism bill has been passed without even me noticing, which allows arrest without warrant on mere suspicion that you are anti-government. Likewise, it seems that China is also taking advantage of the global stupor over this pandemic to worm its way into the UN Commission on Human Rights and establish dominance in the South China Sea, and I think also in the rest of the world. As in Africa, mainland Chinese have spread themselves in these islands, obviously to take possession of the oil and gas reserves that are within our exclusive economic zone. It is said, according to geological surveys, that the reed bank, which is within our waters, has half of the deposits and a quarter of the gas reserves of the entire China Sea. Among my activist friends, there is a growing sense of powerlessness before the giant menace that is China and the government's policy of appeasement and this creeping authoritarianism. Duterte has all the institutions in his pocket. He has Congress, the Senate, the Supreme Court, the military, the bureaucracy. There is no more democratic space. The usual tools of protest no longer work. But then I say there is a church. If there is any institution, any community that is truly global as well as local, it is a church. Where I sit, it seems to be the only countervailing force to all the institutions that have failed. We are global and can stand in solidarity together. And this is my hope for networks like Micah Global. We are also at the grassroots. The history of social movements shows that when the church is truly herself, change happens. And it happens at that level where the narratives change. When we engage the deep structures of our culture so that the meta-narratives, the worldviews change, then social change happens. It is not an accident, for instance, that the language of human rights, of equality between male and female, of slave and free arose out of cultures that are immersed in the Christian tradition, even if they have been secularized. Most Asian cultures have no philosophical basis for this language. There is a great deal of talk these days about this being the end times, that we are at the end of history, according to Fukuyama. But we have seen that it only took 3 months to clean the air in Metro Manila, which is highly polluted, and for the hole in the ozone layer to close a little bit. In other words, like our bodies, the earth has self-renewing mechanisms, given some rest. And maybe instead of Armageddon, the earth is just waiting with eager longing for the revealing of the sons and daughters of God. The earth is waiting for us to show up when there is injustice, show up and bear witness that there can be another world. Now more than ever, I think that we need to practice what Brueggemann calls the prophetic imagination that has been mentioned a while before. We create alternative narratives, a new social imaginary that is beyond the ideologies of our time. I would like to quote and close with this. The prophetic imagination is the most subversive, redemptive act that a leader of a faith community can undertake in the midst of exiles. This work of poetic alternative in the long run is more crucial than one-on-one pastoral care or the careful implementation of institutional goals. This is because the work of poetic imagination holds the potential of unleashing a community of power and action that finally will not be contained by any imperial restrictions and definitions of reality. Jesus' way of teaching parables invited his community of listeners beyond the visible realities of Roman law or restrictive Jewish law. It was out of tradition, specific, open-ended, an alternative society of the kingdom of God. He had no blueprints, no programs like Marxists, but turns people loose from the givens of the day so they can live toward new social possibilities. Unquote. Of us at this juncture of our history as a global community.